Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. I want to talk a little bit about the Council of Chalcedon and some parallels that we find with that whole situation there in the 5th century with the Fourth Ecumenical Council and the fallout and criticisms of that council that last unto this day. I want to draw some parallels between that controversy and the current one that is taking place within the Catholic Church on the new document that was released by the Vatican on same-sex blessings. And so what I want to do is encourage everybody, this is just one of the volumes, but go and read the acts of the Council of Chalcedon. In fact, just read all of the acts that are available in these English translations by Father Richard Price. I highly recommend people do that because I think you will see that there are many parallels between the controversies that were taking place in the first millennium, especially in relation to these ecumenical councils, and the controversies of today. And I think we can learn a lot from the history at the time. I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from, some of the mistakes that were made that we can avoid, what the proper reaction was of the faithful, what the wrong approach was, and so on. I think we can learn from that. So, what I want to do is give you 10 parallels between the Council of Chalcedon and the schism that erupted because of that council, and then the current controversy that is brewing within Catholicism because of this new document. I want to connect the dots here and show you how history repeats itself and what we can learn from that affair with Chalcedon so that we do not repeat the same mistakes and same arguments that were used back then. Okay, let me share my screen and show you an article that I just posted on the website, reasonoftheology.com. I have a link to the article in the show notes. I want to go over this. So, maybe zoom in here a little bit more. There we go. Okay. The 5th century schism and the new same-sex blessings controversy. So I know just at the outset, I would like to offer the following parallels between the schism in the 5th century over the Council of Chalcedon and the current controversy over Fiducia Supplicans, the new Vatican document on same-sex blessings. Okay. The schism of Oriental Orthodoxy, 8 churches that have apostolic succession, that are in communion with one another, that group that we call Oriental Orthodoxy, that schism was started by those who had a misunderstanding of Pope Leo the Great's tome and the Council of Chalcedon in the year 451, the Fourth Ecumenical Council. They misunderstood Pope Leo's tome and the council's reception of that tome, plus other things that happened in the council. So, since they misunderstood it, they broke communion with the Catholic Church and created their own parallel church. Now, here's a parallel. Much like the schism brewing over the misunderstanding of Fiducia Supplicans today, there is a controversy brewing over a misunderstanding of this document in the exact same way as in the 5th century. So note the parallels. In the 5th century, the atmosphere was one of confusion due to the heresy of Nestorianism. Jesus is 2 persons. This is a heresy that was floating around at the time. So the environment was one of confusion. There was this heresy in the environment, even though it had already been condemned at the Council of Chalcedon. There were still those who were, the Council of Ephesus and Chalcedon. But even though it had already been condemned at Ephesus in 431, people were still promoting this in some areas. And they were criticizing Saint Cyril the main player at the Council of Ephesus. Some of their criticisms were legitimate, some of their criticisms weren't, but certainly to dissent against the council was obviously wrong. Now, much like today, as it was in the 5th century, there is an atmosphere of confusion due to the promotion of sexual immorality in society. Yes, maybe the church has been very clear on what is right, what is wrong when it comes to sexual morality, just as we were clear at Ephesus that Nestorianism was wrong. Still, society has been putting forward all sorts of errors in reference to sexual immorality. So today there is an atmosphere of confusion because of that. In the 5th century, many people felt that Leo's tome and Chalcedon were ambiguous on the matter of Nestorianism. Once, sorry, I'm still getting over this sickness that I've had for a while here. In the 5th century, many people felt that Leo's tome and Chalcedon were ambiguous on the matter of Nestorianism. Any reading of the documents of the council, so any reading of Leo's tome and the actual words of the Council of Chalcedon, its definition, and so on, shows that it was not ambiguous. The council was not ambiguous. Leo's tome was not ambiguous. But that was the claim, is that it was ambiguous. In fact, I'll still get people in the comment section on this very video who are Oriental Orthodox. And they, on this very video, will comment and say Leo's tome was Nestorian. Watch. It'll show up in the comment section after I post this on YouTube. Now, there's a parallel here. People today think that Fiducia Supplicans, I'm going to just call it FS, was ambiguous on same-sex blessings, though a simple reading of the document itself shows that is not the case. The 5th century schismatics felt that Chalcedon's talk of two natures sounded Nestorian, since it holds to, that is Nestorianism, holds to two persons. You see, the difference between nature and persons was not something very clear at the time. And also, whenever you're going with different, you're having to translate into different languages, some are speaking in Greek, others are in Syriac, and there's different meanings to these terms in Greek versus Syriac. Language of two natures in Greek might sound like two persons to a Syriac speaking Christian. So when they hear this, they might think, hold on, wait, that sounds like Nestorianism, because of the two concept, and because, some of these things were ironed out as far as proper distinctions, which is partly what Chalcedon was doing, is ironing these things out. And thus there was a need to address them and iron it out. Okay, well, similarly, the critics of FS today say that talk of couples in FS sounds like blessing same-sex unions. Now, I've done a whole video in response to that already, so I would certainly refer you to it. Now, the theologians of the 5th century explained in a very nuanced way that the two natures of Chalcedon are not the same as the two persons of the heresy of Nestorianism. They were careful to note there is a difference. Two natures is not the same as two persons. Now, the critics felt this was sophistry, and a veiled way of promoting Nestorianism, a way to sneak it in the door. Likewise, some today are showing that the highly nuanced position of FS, of blessing same sex couples, is not the same as blessing same sex unions. Blessing couples is in reference to persons. Blessing a union is the blessing of the relationship. Now, obviously, you can't bless the relationship, and the document is clear. So the critics today feel that this is sophistry and a veiled way of promoting blessings for same sex unions. Now, Chalcedon also failed to condemn the letter of Ebos to Mari the Persian, at least in an explicit way. You might argue that there was some kind of implicit condemnation of it, but you'll see why that's problematic. This letter harshly judged Saint Cyril. So the letter of Ebos to Mari the Persian was very problematic. It harshly judged Saint Cyril, and has some very concerning doctrinal problems to it. Now, after a reading of the document, so they read the document out loud before the entire council. After a reading of the document, the council received Ebos back into communion. I mean, he was there present. They receive him back into communion. Now, some might argue, well, yeah, he was received back into communion after condemning Nestorius. And that's not a reception of his letter. It's not a condoning of what he wrote. And that's fair. I imagine that was the case for probably a great deal of the bishops at the council. I'm sure that they were very critical of the letter of Ebos and did not accept it in any way. However, after he's brought back into communion, some at the council spoke well of the letter of Ebos. And one, particularly the Patriarch of Antioch, even said that the letter was orthodox. And no rebuke came from the rest of the Chalcedonian fathers. Again, highly unlikely that the Chalcedonian fathers thought it was orthodox. I mean, I'll grant that. But there was no debate. There was no pushback on that comment. The argument of the schismatics in the 5th century was that Chalcedon's failure to condemn the letter of Ebos, explicitly at least, meant it was in favor of Nestorianism, especially if you have one of the council fathers, Antioch, saying it's orthodox. In other words, they believed that its failure to condemn the letter showed that the proper way to interpret Chalcedon was that it was Nestorian, despite the fact that Chalcedon explicitly rejected Nestorianism, and Ebos was required to anathematize Nestorius to be received back into communion. He was required to do that. He did it multiple times. He's received back into communion. But they say, well, because you didn't condemn explicitly the letter of Ebos, it's Nestorian. The council is Nestorian. Now, notice the parallel here. Even today, some clergy have not been disciplined, at least so far, for their disregard of FS. Think here of Father James Horn. Some critics in the church today claim that if they are not disciplined, then that shows that the correct way to interpret FS is that it is in favor of blessing the union of same-sex couples, despite the fact that the document clearly rejects the blessing of the union. You see the parallel. It's a direct parallel. And I'm hearing it a lot, and it's a really bad argument. The reason why it's a bad argument is, if the critics are right about FS, then it would also follow that Chalcedon was Nestorian. Oriental orthodoxy was right, And Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy are wrong. So one would need to be consistent here. If we say a failure to correct an abuse is the proper way to interpret a document, then just apply that to Chalcedon, and you will become Oriental Orthodox overnight, and you will leave the Catholic Church. Be consistent. It's a bad argument. Very bad argument. Now, the schismatics in the 5th century claimed that Saint Cyril was on their side and that it was they who held the traditional faith, which they said Chalcedon rejected. So they were, all saying, hey, we're the real heirs of Saint Cyril and his theology. The Oriental Orthodox were saying, he's our father in the faith. And you guys are rejecting Saint Cyril. You guys are Nestorians. Even though Chalcedon explicitly accepts Saint Cyril and his teachings, accepts him as a father of the faith, and his theology is very important at Chalcedon. So there's no rejection of Saint Cyril at Chalcedon, but that is the accusation that's being made by the schismatics in the 5th century, and they're saying, we're the ones who hold to the traditional faith. Chalcedon has abandoned tradition. Now, notice the parallel. Citing their favorite figures today, the critics of FS claim they are the ones who hold to the traditional faith. And they often claim FS has rejected the traditional faith, much like the 5th century schismatics. Now, the schism that the critics of Chalcedon caused in the 5th century lasts unto this day. As I said, I will get people in the comment section on this video. Just check it out. Look in the comment section down below after this post for a day or two, and you'll see some Oriental Orthodox saying, Leo's tome was Nestorian. They're still around. They're still here. 1,600 years later, we're still having that same battle from the controversy that they created back then. Now, will the schism that has been brewing among the critics of the Holy See, including the critics of FS, also last for the next 1,600 years? There's something to think about. If you were living in the 5th century at the time of Chalcedon, it would have been really hard to see that a 1,600-year-old schism is about to be established. It'd be really hard to see it. It'd be also very easy to get caught up in that schism and think that you're holding to the traditional faith, when in fact you're now joining a parallel church that for the next 1,600 years will be broken away from the Catholic Church. 1,600 years and counting. Now, the critics of FS today would likely have been the critics of Chalcedon and the schismatics of the 5th century, as their criticisms and methods are almost identical. The same criticisms and methods and approach that the 5th century schismatics used to reject Chalcedon is the exact same type of method and criticisms that the critics of FS offer today. So if you were to take these people and transport them back into the 5th century, they likely would have joined the Oriental Orthodox and broken away from the Catholic Church. Now, lastly, the faithful in the 5th century, the faithful, were those who sided with the Holy See. The Tome of Leo is obviously the Holy See, right? Leo the Great, Pope Leo the Great. And the reception of that document at Chalcedon was a siding with the Holy See. And so those who departed from Chalcedon were breaking communion with the Holy See. Likewise, the faithful of today will be those who side with the Holy See, not those who break communion with it, and not those who judge the Holy See, as the 5th century schismatics did. The ones who sided with Chalcedon sided with the magisterium are the ones that we say are vindicated today, 1600 years later. We say they're the right ones. The Oriental Orthodox are still around, and they say that they're the right ones. Well, we know that Chalcedon was right because, again, that was the position of the Holy See. Likewise, with the critics of the Holy See today, I don't think history is going to judge them very well. If you want to be on the right side of history, you side with the Holy See. If you have some criticisms, you do so within communion of the Holy See, and you keep it level-headed, fair, and balanced. In the exact same way that faithful Catholics in the 5th century could criticize some aspects of Chalcedon. I'll give you an example. One thing that had to be cleaned up by the next ecumenical council, the 5th ecumenical council, the whole reason for the 5th ecumenical council was because, in part, the 4th ecumenical council, Chalcedon, did not sufficiently address the letter of Ebos. And you did have a few there who accepted it as orthodox. That caused confusion and problems. And so it was legitimate to criticize Chalcedon on those grounds. It doesn't follow that Chalcedon is Nestorian because it did it. It just means that, yeah, Chalcedon could have done better there. And thus we had to have a whole nother ecumenical council to clean up the mess there and the failure to engage that. Likewise, we could be critical of some things of the Holy See today, while doing so in communion with the church and not attributing heresy and error to the magisterium. So in the exact same way that we could critique Chalcedon, we can also critique FS or anything else by the Holy See. But that's not good enough for most of the critics. Most of the critics want to say, no, this is an acceptance of sin. No, this is heresy. And I just want to say, again, as a reminder, I know I said it before, I just want to say it as a reminder. You know, just think for a moment, for those of you critics who think that the Holy See has now embraced heresy or that the Holy See is now blessing sin. Okay, I just have one thing for you to consider aside from the fact that you're just factually wrong. You're telling people, hey, come to the one and only true Catholic Church because we're the ones that hold to the traditions of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus in its fullness. But we also violate the teachings of Jesus by blessing sin. I just want to say, you will never be taken seriously by anyone ever again if that's your position. I think you're forced to conclude at that point that, you know what, if this is true, if the church really is officially blessing sin, how can I really in good conscience continue to make the claims that I make about the Catholic Church? I think you need to be honest with yourself and honest with other people and ask yourself, does this not falsify the claims of the Catholic Church? Now, I don't believe that the Catholic Church has falsified itself. I would just simply tell you, check your premises. Check your assumption that the church does officially bless sin. You're wrong about that. So rather than leave the church, I would just simply say, no, just check your faulty assumptions and cease from conceding ground to the devil by saying now that the church blesses sin. And learn from the mistakes of the schismatics of the 5th century and learn from the faithful of the 5th century, those who sided with the Holy See. So anyways, those are some parallels I wanted to bring to y'all's attention that I think are certainly applicable to today. I hope y'all enjoyed this. If so, hit that like button and especially the subscribe button so I can reach more people with this content you appreciate here with Reason and Theology. And of course, check me out also at patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support the show. Okay, God bless. Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy. It engages all of the arguments that Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent. because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for your copy today.